Over the past 15 years, Naughty Dog has become well known for imbuing each one of their games with a strong cinematic flair. Their titles are renowned for their exceptional writing, character development, and storytelling. This story-centric praise may be well deserved, but it also risks losing something critical to the periphery, the game part of the video game. When examining the studio's last two mainline releases, Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, and The Last of Us Part 2, something becomes clear. Despite the immense backlash and mixed reception to The Last of Us Part 2's story, it's an unequivocally better video game than Uncharted 4. Here's why. The first three mainline Uncharted titles were decidedly cover shooters of their time. They borrowed heavily from the groundbreaking Gears of War, while adding their own unique selling point, large, interactive set pieces right out of an Indiana Jones movie. When The Last of Us arrived in 2013, it added several new layers to the Naughty Dog gameplay experience. The first layer allowed players to, while between shootouts, scavenge for ammunition and supplies, which they could then craft into useful weapons and distractions for the next combat encounter. The second layer was a dynamic and robust stealth and melee system. If players ran out of ammo or wanted to conserve resources, they could try and take out enemy NPCs without being spotted. If they failed and were discovered, they could use bricks, planks of wood, or parts of the environment to defeat foes while unarmed. These changes provided a welcome depth to the gameplay of the studio's third-person shooters. When it came time to release the final mainline Uncharted, which arrived 3 years after the original Last of Us, players expected the game to take some influence from the title. When Uncharted 4 arrived, it borrowed the veneer of what made The Last of Us combat sandboxes engaging, but neglected enough of its core elements to feel shallow and disjointed by comparison. Uncharted 4 borrows the dynamic stealth, upgraded AI, and environmental takedowns from The Last of Us. Players can transition in and out of stealth and eliminate combatants from rope swings or vertical platforms. Uncharted 4 does not, however, borrow the crafting, inventory management, or resource acquisition fundamentals from The Last of Us. In Uncharted 4, time between shootouts is spent climbing, exploring, and exchanging quips with friendly NPCs. The player does not, and does not need to, prepare for upcoming combat to the extent that's required in The Last of Us. Ammo is plentiful in Uncharted 4, and extra combat tools like the fourth game's signature grappling hook are available to the player at all times. By contrast, the emphasis on scarcity in The Last of Us made scavenging and preparing before each encounter essential. On higher difficulty settings, frantically looking for resources could be just as intense as the combat itself, with the knowledge that coming up empty-handed could lead to a much tougher fight. This added layer of intensity makes Last of Us a richer gameplay experience. In Uncharted 4, the absence of scarcity as a gameplay mechanic leads to a disconnect between the combat sections and exploration sections. What you do before the next enemy encounter has very little bearing on your success. Subsequently, The Last of Us's interconnected gameplay loop looks more like disconnected gameplay sections when examining its shallow translation in Uncharted 4. The feeling that large swaths of the game are free of consequence or relevance to the player's immediate future hurts the game's engagement. By contrast, The Last of Us feels much more interesting on a moment-to-moment basis. This contrast is specifically felt during the initial stealth phases of both of the game's combat encounters. In Uncharted 4 and The Last of Us, the player will generally enter a combat sandbox with the element of surprise. In The Last of Us, this may be either an advantage or a necessity, depending on how much ammo the player was able to collect prior to the encounter. If the player runs out of ammo, they have the ability to flee the enemy's sightline and re-enter stealth, allowing them to complete the section without guns. In Uncharted 4, the player has the same dynamic stealth options. However, the presence of more ammo and a larger health pool completely remove the weight of successfully taking out enemies in stealth. In The Last of Us, you're not just conserving supplies for one scuffle by staying undetected, but rather carrying them forward into future encounters if you're consistently frugal during combat. Dropping onto NPCs from a grappling hook is fun, but it barely grants a meaningful advantage to the immediate challenge and does not impact the rest of the game in any way. This makes Uncharted 4's dynamic stealth gameplay mechanic feel less important than it does in The Last of Us. Stealth and environmental takedowns in Uncharted are a flashy way to execute an encounter. In The Last of Us, they're a critical part of a far more engaging gameplay loop. In summary, Naughty Dog knows how to tell a cinematic and engaging story. While the conversation tends to center around these stories, the differences in how their games play are equally, if not more important to the player experience. Uncharted 4: A Thief's End borrows gameplay mechanics from its 2013 predecessor, The Last of Us, but leaves out enough of its foundation to ruin what made its gameplay intense and unique. The Last of Us's crafting, scavenging, and stealth elements make its combat sandboxes far more interconnected to the rest of its gameplay, and Uncharted 4's stealth, in lacking these components, feels inconsequential and superfluous. Additionally, the removal of the crafting system turns a gameplay loop, where your performance in each section impacts the next, into a disconnected and far less interesting experience. These differences render The Last of Us as much deeper and more impactful on the gameplay front, and since it is, after all, a video game, it's my preferred experience between the two titles. Thank you for watching and have a good rest of your day.